Let's welcome our new person. Hi, how are you? Yeah,
Sorry, I'm late.
okay.
My traffic.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, morning everyone, Philip Clay. I'm with LabCorp Genetics. Currently I come from CPG, but I wound up in the world of healthcare. Anyway, it's good to meet you all. I lead operations there, end-to-end operation from traditional and stuff. Planning, buying, moving, serving, that's what.
Well, it's good to have you. I think we've got a accident in Georgia and we've got snow in Chicago. So I had a number of people and then I've got a person in transit. So we just have to be flexible today. Fred, do you want to introduce yourself? Awesome. Thank you. Go ahead.
What I've done first year I used to here. I'm here.
Awesome. We're excited you can be here. Okay, awesome.
Hi everyone, my name is Natasha and I'm a student here at Tech and I'm also here.
Okay, there's a common thread here. Good. Okay, and so maybe we can influence Dr. Goldman on your survey or your panel. Yes, go ahead.
I'm a student, I'm a PhD student and I study and will use life changing and the different perspectives associated with it. Give us something.
Okay, all right, Vinny.
Hello, everyone. My name is Benny Larum. I lead supply chain innovation at Converse. Previous to that, spent 14 years at Procter & Gamble. I'm a self-proclaimed supply chain nerd, so I just like to just learn as much as I can to apply.
Yeah, we have a few of the supply chain nerds, right? And so Nike owns Converse, and so it's good to have you, Benny. Go ahead.
Bill Lynch, I'm supply chain philosopher, and I primarily do teaching and I am trying to bring everything. I'm self-proclaimed supply chain evangelist, because I'm trying to bring supply chain to daylight, because most of us are sort of laboring in the dark. So.
Okay, awesome. Peter, how many people do we have online?
Yeah.
Okay, and the question about what is value in the supply chain or value in a value chain is something that I've been researching for 15 years. And the design of this is not like a classroom. It's not like I'm going to present and, you know, you're going to sit, I'm going to put you to work. It's a round table. So you're going to talk to each other. And the format is that I've laid out the table. So you've got a business leader, a consultant, or an independent expert, and you've got some students at each of the tables. And what I want to do is elevate the discussion so that you really internalize the concepts, because the concepts are deep. And in the boundaries, one of the things I want you to do is say there are no stupid questions. So if you got a question, just raise your hand, right? You know, there's no stupid questions. We're all learners. I want you to avoid rabbit holes. So Joseph has spent 18 months doing models. And I got a true confession. I sat on the back row of my statistics class. If you go down a rabbit hole on the 15th iteration of Joseph's model, I'm going to pull you up and say that's a great discussion for break. You know, so I want to keep the conversation going. I also want to be sure there's equal airtime. So I'll pick on Fred. If Fred goes on and on and on and on and on, I'll say, Fred, let's just condense this so that we have equal airtime. And I want to have conversations in the center of the room. So if you're talking to your neighbor, I'll say, is there a conversation that you'd like to share? Because at the end of the day, what I want to do is move on and get some insight into the work that we've been doing for 18 months on regression analysis by industry off of data from 1980 to 2023 around what drives supply chain value. So, Peter, what did the folks on Zoom say about what is value in the value chain? Fred, can I ask you to scribe? Can you just put it on? This is our flip chart fill-in substitute. So there are black markers here. Yeah. So we'll have the transcript and we'll also capture the audio and the video. So we'll put it on YouTube. We'll clean it up. So, so
So this from Matt, Spooner, support the goals of the organization. This from Zone Lead, maximizing revenue and minimizing cost at each step of the value chain. Value is something that customers want to pay for, something that adds to the customer's life at the end of the supply chain.
okay, so I think you're a little faster than Fred can write. And Fred feels bad about his handwriting. So I was an engineer and my work in engineering totally decimated my handwriting. So your handwriting's a lot better. So something that customers are willing to pay for at every step of the supply chain.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's probably 10 more.
Uh-huh. Okay. How about in the room? Fred? Or your table? What did you think value is? How do you measure value in a supply chain?
Well, what we kind of come up with was a three markers coming up on the table. It was more so something that's novel and new to the customer.
Uh-huh.
Impact of that product to your customer.
So innovation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then how well you serve your end customer, our products and how well you meet their goals.
How well do you meet your goals? I'm just repeating it for the people online. There's nothing worse than being on a Zoom call and you can't hear, right? Okay. And okay, innovation and how well do you meet your customers' goals? Bill, Benny or Bill or someone at this table, how do you define value?
So we were discussing how it's kind of a difficult question to answer because you've got the end customer, you've usually got within the supply chain middle customers, and then for for-profit companies, you have shareholders, and you have to deliver value to everybody. And so how you go about measuring that really gets kind of tricky.
Okay, so value gets tricky because we have multiple stakeholders. Okay, Mary, how about your table?
Well, we didn't get beyond introduction.
Okay.
That's to each other, but
Okay.
I would add that in my world as a supply chain and having the relationships with retailers, I think about it from our direct customers. It's really driving joint value between both organizations. So we have to have those strategic partnerships and those strategic discussions with the retailers. But in order to get to that point, we also have to be getting the fundamentals right that we're working on in full before they want to talk to us about future strategy.
Okay, so we use this, we're going to create joint value. And we talk about collaboration a lot in the industry, but how do you measure it? Is it, better fulfillment? Is it turn at the shelf? We don't have good measurements. So Peter, your table, what's value? John?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't think we got much farther than talking about keeping interest in the stakeholders.
Yes. Right. Yeah, the supply chain has become more political, I think, than the national and international news cycles. As we have had a lot of changes in generations and technology. Rich, you're welcome to come and sit at this table. Come be part of the party. Don't sit on the edge. This is Rich Katz. I met Rich first when he ran Alimica, which is a B2B network in the chemical industry, and now he helps PE firms to decide how to invest, right, Rich?
That's right.
And so Rich is a late ad, and it's good to have you. So the research that we're going to share was funded, Joseph's time, the computers, et cetera, was funded by Kinaxis. Dr. Goldsman and I volunteered our time, and we used a data set from 1980 to 2023. It's based upon 12 years of research on the supply chain Stoudemire. Has anybody looked at the supply chain Stoudemire report? Yeah, okay. It's something that we do annually, and I'm waiting for the final results of Joseph's work. No urgency, Joseph, to write the one for this year. what I'm trying to do is give the manufacturers and retailers a benchmark around how do I think about industry trends and potential in the industry. And, just a little background on me, I consider myself a social scientist. If I go to a barbecue or a party and people say, "What do you do, Laura?" I say, "Well, I'm a researcher." And they'll say, "Well, isn't that a consultant?" And I say, "No, consultants know the answers and researchers are trying to figure out the questions." So I write for Forbes and I write on LinkedIn and I write for the Supply Chain Leader. And I used to work at a company called Gartner, and I don't work there anymore because Gartner writes for the IT audience. And my goal was to write for the business leader to really help to elevate the conversations to the next level. I do some writing around technology, but this is where you'll find me. I'm followed by 339,000 people on LinkedIn, and I give thanks for that. And hopefully you'll follow my research. So in the beginning, I wrote a book called Bricks Matter, which was based upon 18 years of working with 600 companies around what mattered in supply chain. And I had a person review my book by the name of Keith Harrison. Does anybody know Keith? This would be like 2010. So Benny, you may have worked for Keith, right? So tell the group, stand up, tell the group a little bit about Keith.
I don't know too much about him, but he eventually became chief supply chain officer at P&G. And so during that time, there was a lot of global expansion. So we entered into markets like China, Latin America, South America. And so Keith was instrumental in designing supply chain throughout the world. So probably led a team of like 40,000 people at P&G. A well-regarded leader.
And actually, I think he did a great job on people development and building the global supply chain for P&G. If I think about, the top 5 people that I've met in supply chain leadership, I would put Keith on that list. And Keith was kind enough when he retired from P&G to review my book. And one of the premises of the book was that our traditional supply chain focus and investments have been to reduce cost, and that we need to shift from reducing cost to driving value. And reducing cost does not drive value. And most of the optimization that we have worked on reduces cost in a function. And because the supply chain is a complex nonlinear system, if I reduce cost in a singular function like transportation or manufacturing, I may throw the supply chain out of balance, reducing the ability to drive customer service and reducing the ability to create value on the stages of the supply chain to really drive innovation of things like new products. And unfortunately, most of the technology and most of our processes are focused on lowering cost. And if you do read my research, when I do surveys of CFOs and I say, what is supply chain excellence? They will say it's the lowest cost supply chain. Most supply chains are not singular, meaning that you don't have one flow. You typically have 5 flows. You've got a very efficient flow, which is very forecastable, which can be run as the lowest cost. Then you will have something that is around innovation, which is more of an agile supply chain, not forecastable, very lumpy, high bullwhip effect. And that is not a supply chain you can run at the lowest cost. We talk about agile, but the agile supply chain of the same cost, quality, and customer service can never be run effectively at the lowest cost. So we have efficient, we have the innovation flow, and then we may have a flow that is something that is at the end of the life cycle where we're phasing things out. And so we don't have a good way in the supply chain to manage the life cycles of things that we're phasing out because we're traditionally looking at history and we're thinking that history is a better predictor of future demand. So when I wrote this book, Keith said, you talk about the movement from focus on cost to value, which I totally agree with. He said, but I was never able to have a good discussion at the board level at P&G on what is value. So this research that we're going to talk about is coming from that question. And the first thing I did was I hired Arizona State University, a person by the name of George Runger, who David ironically knew. Well, I had started out, I hired some students to do regression analysis on data that I'd gotten from Y Charts. And Y Charts is a syndicated data feed of public information. And, you get into Y Charts and it's like, 300 metrics and which metrics really matter. And there was a person by the name of Manny from Intel who saw the work and he said, Laura, you haven't done enough work on really looking at, collinearity and, your models don't hold water. And so he introduced me to George Runger. And at that point in time, I had a lot of issues around what is an industry. So SIC codes, NACS codes are not good definitions for an industry. And we talk about industry differences. So we spent quite a bit of time saying, what is an industry? And what we did was we used our insights and we formed the industries. And then we would ask people in the industry, are these what you would consider your peer group? So we went through a number of interviews around that. The other thing is the data that we were using came right at the end of the financial recession in 2013, and we had a shorter time horizon, and that was pretty ugly data coming out of the financial recession. So I kind of did the supply chains to admire analysis for 11 years. And then I said what I wanted to do was to do a more holistic discussion because there is nothing in the literature, the academic literature, that defines value. I worked on a DBA at Temple, and one of the things I did was an extensive research assessment of what is value, and there is nothing in the literature that defines what is value in the value chain. So as a result, what we're doing is we're chasing cost, which throws us out of balance. So we started this project that we're going to share with you today around a discussion about what is value. So I had Peter and Joseph do another academic survey of the literature to be able to look at what is value, and there is nothing there. And then I had David interview other professors to be able to look at what is value. So people in finance, people in strategy, and there are lots of things that people will talk about, but there's nothing that's really clearly defined as what is value. So we started with price to book, market capitalization, price to tangible book, and what is called a fundamental score, which is a financial metric that the investors use to say, is that company driving value? We pretty quickly got rid of the fundamental score because it just wasn't good. And we also got rid of EBITDA, and we got rid of price to book and price to tangible book. And we decided to really center the research on market capitalization per employee. Now, market cap is the number of shares outstanding times the value of the share divided by the number of employees in the company. And the reason why we wanted to divide it by the number of employees in the company is that helps us to normalize the data for big companies versus small companies. So we spent about 3 months in this discussion. And David, what did you learn from this discussion? If you want to come up here, you can talk into the mic so the Zoom folks can hear. So David's moving to the table, and David was my partner in crime here from Georgia Tech. So what did you learn from the academic research and this discussion?
Yeah, well, like Laura said, we were really surprised that when we went through literature, it was actually very difficult to find mathematically rigorous papers, even general papers on the definition of value in supply chain. I think I'm not an expert in this, but it seems that a lot of the concern is just how do I get to the next quarter? How do I make the company look good with the last 3 months, or as opposed to what's the company really worth? What's it getting out of the supply chain? So, be that as it may, it was very hard to track down papers, and I guess it's a good thing we'll get to publish new papers on it. but we had a lot of discussion on what metrics should we use to measure value. Laura put some potential ones up here. We eventually settled down on market cap per employee. There may be others. I'm not qualified to judge that, but it certainly made sense. And you'll see when I give my talk a little bit later that we had adequate data to measure this for each of the well-defined company sectors, and then for each company within the sector.
Great, thanks. Now, Peter, you spent a lot of time on the SCORE model and ASCM. You want to come up? How does SCORE define value? So Peter used to work at ASCM. For everybody know what ASCM is? Anybody not know? Okay. Yeah. Okay. And Peter, how many years did you work for in SCORE, which is the supply chain operating research model, right?
Correct. So I've been doing that since 1996. So I was with 3M at the time. So I'm a user of it and a practitioner of it. So to answer your question directly, I think in the latest edition of the model, and again, those can find it at scor.ascm.org. There's no login credentials. It's a free access model. I think we really looked at it as three big buckets. But again, trying to use the balanced scorecard. One is focused on resilience, which is really customer-centric measures. The other one was economic factors, which tried to broaden it beyond just cost to more operating, but we never get to the market capitalization. So this is a good one. And then the last one then is sustainability. So we're trying to catch up with your research a little bit.
Okay. So I would encourage you to look at the SCORE model. I actually sat on the SCORE Council for about 10 years on the advisory group. And it is a good reference model for people to be able to give the flow of the supply chain. And it's amazing when you go to industry and you say, how do you define supply chain? And I would encourage you to do this if you're interviewing for a job. You should always say to the person that you're being interviewed by, how do you define supply chain? Because it's very different by each company. And how do you define supply chain excellence? And you're going to find as many different definitions as you'll find flavors of ice cream in an ice cream shop. And that's one of the issues in the industry as you do research is we don't have this clear definition. So I've been working on 10 years of analysis in these supply chains to admire reports, and this is actually available, and I give you the link here. And I give it out free. And what I do is I am really focused on trying to help business leaders develop a balanced scorecard. Now, have folks read Kaplan's book on the balanced scorecard? It's printed in 1992, which I think is one of the very best business books. And there's no established definition for what is a balanced scorecard in supply chain. Now, Peter talked a little bit about the SCORE work, but how do you measure a balanced scorecard? And how do you move from functional metrics into corporate metrics to be able to really communicate to the street and the investors? And so a balanced scorecard looks at four main elements, according to Kaplan: learning and growth, which is all about human resources, business processes, customers, and finance. And what we're going to be talking in our regression analysis work is this finance question of how do you measure progress at a financial level? And what defines supply chain excellence? So I define supply chain excellence of the alignment of source, make, and deliver. Now we have a new definition of make, right, Peter? So sources, procurement, make, transform is all about making things. Delivery is all about moving things to derive a successful operating strategy. But in my research, what I find is only 5% of companies are clear on their operating strategy. And what it comes down to in practical terms is how do we reduce cost? And there's also a misconception that if I have this triangle of customer service, inventory, and cost, that I'm going to drive goodness. And this is not true. This is a false understanding of the industry. And the issue is that we have nothing here that defines our asset strategy. And, 35 to 45% of goods are outsourced, somebody else's assets. And what we do in assets really defines what our capabilities are. So this particular triangle actually evolved in the 1980s, 1990s, and is one of the backbones of supply chain planning. But it misses a lot of the definition of supply chain excellence. And a lot of times people will say, well, inventory, right? Is inventory cost or is it buffer? And it is both waste and buffer. And our most important buffer in the supply chain is inventory. And we have spent many decades implementing technology, but when you look at inventory over time, the average industry holds 28 more days of inventory. And the reason is most of our optimization focuses on safety stock, not form and function of inventory. So we're not necessarily looking at in-transit inventory because we're moving more goods on water and trains, or looking at our ability to manage manufacturing cycle stock as we've elongated the product lines. We have more cycle stock. So cycle stock is the ability to go through the product line from the beginning to the end. And if I elongate the product line, then I have more cycle stock. So I've grown in-transit inventory and I've grown cycle stock. And I also have what is slow and obsolete that some people call slob in the industry. And most organizations struggle to really digest and get rid of slob. So in the days that I used to implement advanced planning, safety stock was about 45% of total inventory. We were small regional companies, and safety stock was a major part of inventory. And most of the inventory optimization technologies are really focused on safety stock. But in the training that I do once a year on building outside-in processes, what I have found is that safety stock, the buffer between demand and supply, has actually now, for the global manufacturer greater than 5 billion, about 15% of total inventory. So there is a need for us to shift our thinking from looking at safety stock to thinking about form and function of inventory. What form should I hold goods in? Should they be semi-finished goods? Should they be finished goods? And the function of inventory and transit inventory, cycle stock, safety stock, and slow and obsolete. Unfortunately, because most companies manage functional silos, manufacturing, transportation, inventory, they don't really look at what is value and how to trade off the choices in a silo against a balanced scorecard. And the lowest cost supply chain or the efficient supply chain does not create an effective supply chain. So these are issues that we struggle with as we think about moving from traditional functional linear supply chains to thinking about nonlinear and more encompassing supply chains. And this concept of the supply chain as a complex nonlinear system, I think, is also not well understood. And that as you stand up these functions are not aligned. So if I save money in transportation, I may actually increase the cost of manufacturing. Same thing with procurement. If I save money in procurement, I may actually increase total cost. And only 29% of companies can easily get to total cost. And most of the focus is on functional cost. So why does this matter, right? So if you think about our IT investments, 90% of companies have enterprise resource planning systems, 82% of companies have advanced planning systems. And the concept was I would put inputs into an engine, which would have a model, which would have an output. And academics all over the world have great models. But the problem is that these outputs don't align, and the average company has 15 to 20 models that aren't aligned. So the model for inventory doesn't align for the model with manufacturing. Transportation planning has nothing in common with distribution planning. And so what was happened is we are investing and models that are not aligned to a balanced scorecard and not aligned necessarily to each other. And as a result, we throw the supply chain out of balance. Now, what I think is tragic right now is we're in love with AI, and we are putting AI into the engines without really stepping back and say, how do we redefine work? And how do we align the engines to be able to drive value and to be able to manage multiple supply chains? And we got a question from the group. So the question, I'm going to repeat for the audience, is can I talk about what is aligned? Yeah, so a transportation management system, often called TMS in the industry, something Rich is very familiar with because he actually sold it for many years, is trying to reduce transportation cost, trying to maximize customer service and reduce transportation cost. But what is the role of transportation cost and value? Think back to the pandemic where, cost of a container went up 60, 70%. Our goal shouldn't have really been there to reduce transportation costs, right? And then I've got distribution requirements planning, which is coming out of traditional advanced planning, which the goal of that is really inventory to an order. So transportation planning and distribution requirements planning are not aligned on the objective function. Transportation is trying to reduce cost. And basically, a lot of combinatorial math has been sold in the industry, which has us go out and look at the least cost of transportation, but people don't have to pick up the loads. So you go out for first pass tender and they say, yeah, I said I was going to carry that, but I don't have a truck. Distribution requirements planning is putting inventory on an order, so they're not aligned. Also, inventory is not necessarily aligned with manufacturing scheduling. The manufacturing scheduling is looking at how do I put what's called a planned order on a production line to make a product. But typically inventory optimization is focused on safety stock. Manufacturing and inventory are not necessarily aligned because most manufacturing organizations run based upon OEE, which is efficiency and high asset utilization. And that throws us out of balance. So we have in our legacy of technology, lots of engines, lots of models, and they're not aligned. So as you go out and you recruit, you're going to find that you've got models and engines all over the organization, and they're not aligned to a balanced scorecard. We're optimizing within a function, but not really driving market cap per employee or not really driving a better inventory or necessarily better customer service. A good question. So Rich Katz from the audience says they're not only aligned, they're conflicting. So Rich, give us an example of their conflicting.
Like mentioned, they not aligned with keeping safety. They're different.
Right.
So I think that's a completely different function. They're about keeping the inventory at the level that is most appropriate to serve the customer. So that's different right there.
So Rich, if you think back, in the 1990s, when we deployed advanced planning, we typically had 10 to 15 planners, small regional organizations. Now, I work with a company that has 1,400 planners. They have these models all over the organization. They don't realize that these models are not aligned. And, it's hard to manage these larger organizations and all of these models don't align. So Pravin, you didn't introduce yourself. You came in late, but it's good to see you. Can you just kind of stand up and tell people about yourself? So Western Digital, which he's part of, makes a lot of, you think about jump drives or you think about drives, right? And, when I first started working with Western Digital, they're saying, nothing's forecastable, which most people don't measure the coefficient of variation to say, is this product forecastable before they slap an engine on it? And, they don't necessarily improve the demand. And what we find is, 90% of people with conventional demand planning processes are actually decreasing the effectiveness of demand planning processes because they're not measuring forecast value add, which is really looking at how good is that model? And, so you've been very deep in inventory management, right? Not so deep in demand planning and very deep in transportation, but because they're so deep in transportation and they're not aligned on inventory and demand, it causes friction in the organization. Is that fair for me to say? So 150, 200? Okay, so a lot of people, right? And these people are often in regional centers, and the regional centers aren't necessarily aligned to the division, and the divisions aren't necessarily aligned to corporate, and the functions aren't necessarily aligned. And so what we have are a lot of models that are deployed in an organization that aren't aligned. Then we have a lot of hardworking people running these models. And in the 1990s, when we built these models, we were arguing about 32-bit versus 64-bit architectures. And so the models were very constrained based upon technology. Today, we don't have those constraints, but we're not thinking out of the box about how do we start at the top, define value, and then redefine work so that our models are aligned to a balanced scorecard and our employees are aligned to work together and we can drive better outcomes. Did we answer your question? It's Western Digital is a great case study. Thank you for sharing, and it's good to see you. Hey, David, can you come up here so that people can hear you on Zoom? Peter, do we have anything happening on Zoom to talk about at this point in time? Okay.
Just ask to continue to summarize the questions from the audience.
Okay, because I know that the hearing will be difficult. So, when I see people that are talking about AI into conventional models of advanced planning, I just go crazy. It's the stupidest thing in the world because making our current models run faster is just not going to get us where we need to go. David, come and you want to give a comment.
Well, don't disparage AI because the machines are going to remember that.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to add one comment to Elijah's great question about alignment. This is a synergistic example. It's not necessarily supply chain, but it's very, very close. There are a lot of big enemies within airlines. I don't know if we have any Delta people here, but if we did, if you were a maintenance planner or a crew scheduler or a flight director
or a food deliverer,
you would hate each other because everything that you do is in complete disalignment with the other people, and they don't talk to each other. And what happens when there's a little bit of a snowstorm in Denver? Not Delta, but say JetBlue goes offline for 5 days, or Southwest Airline goes offline because nobody's talking to each other and they don't plan. So that's all I had to say. It's a great question.
So every organization has this internal friction, which becomes more politics. But, I checked in for my Delta flight and they said, we appreciate you being a million miler. And I said, well, I'm a million miler for American and United, which means that I spent way too much time on an airplane. But I remember there was a period of time where Delta used to reward employees for taking off on time. Now that sounds like a great measurement, right? Did we take off on time? But I watched over 6 months just almost fist fights at the door because they couldn't agree on what code to give that flight about why they weren't on time, right? So the maintenance guy would say, nah, it wasn't my problem. And the guy on the food truck would say, hey, it's not my problem. And I would watch them, really get into these verbal arguments at the door. And I'm like, I just really want to take off. So you've really got to be careful about your measurement. And if you interview for a job, you need to say, what do you measure? And are people aligned to that measure? And how do you know what good looks like? And if we put better, faster math into existing engines, we don't necessarily improve outcomes. Yeah, Peter? Peter's going to come to the mic so people can hear. And I think we're going to go through a hype cycle where we get what I'm going to call AI bloat, because we're going to try to put sophisticated engines into models that aren't aligned.
So I'm going to double click on AI bloat for just a second. So I've spent the last 3 years on supply chain innovation, AI, and digital transformation. So a couple of facts. One is only 30% of the functionality that you bought 5 years ago, you're actually using. You know, Excel kind of makes up the rest. Supply chain excellent organizations have moved toward 80%, but they've really rethought, how do I integrate and think cross-functionally? The interesting thing about AI is everybody's talking about trustworthy AI. Well, if you can't put trustworthy AI into untrustworthy supply chain models and expect to get better outcomes. And I just wanted to reinforce that because there was a number of comments on Zoom that talked about the AI hype cycle, and then how does that really relate back to supply chain excellence and these concepts. So I just wanted to bring that forward.
So we have a number of technologists that are building traditional supply chain planning on new architectures. And one of the things that I am trying to say to the industry is we need to build our processes outside in. 80% of the data in the world is not used in the supply chain. So this is what I'm working on about an outside-in model, and the blue area is what we currently have for advanced planning. And I think we need to surround it with our ability to sense what's happening in the market, whether it's weather or unstructured data from rating and reviews, or looking at social media, or looking at what's happening on store traffic or baskets, or what's happening on, the sales and the channel. And on supply, looking at relative cost. And we're going to get more and more issues around compliance to countries, whether it's deforestation or Russia or Iran, or what's happening in the EU with the 2027 mandate on the digital passport. So the whole ability to track and trace, not map, but track and trace, is going to increase. And we don't have really a supply chain master data layer that helps us to measure variability, things like in transit time. But you can see up here at the top is the balanced scorecard. Companies do not have a balanced scorecard, and they're not clear what is value. So let's go on the journey.